Welcome to The Sovereign Thinker, where history, philosophy, and geopolitics come together. And today, we're diving into part 2 of this episode on Russia's geopolitical realities and the real reasons behind the invasion of Ukraine. If you missed part 1, go check it out first because it gives crucial context for this misunderstood conflict. And in this video, we'll be discussing why Ukraine was indeed invaded by Russia and the conclusion to this war. Stick around to the very end to hear the answers. So, why did Russia invade Ukraine? The media loves to call it an unprovoked attack, casting Ukraine as a vibrant democracy looking to join the Western family, while Russia clings to outdated autocratic ideals. In the last episode, we discussed how global events often get presented as black and white stories, oversimplifying history and reality. But geopolitics is way more complicated than good versus evil or old versus new. We also touched on something critical: geographical determinism, the idea that a nation's geography determines its destiny. For Russia, geography has dictated its security strategies for centuries. In other words, like a game of poker, every country has to play with the hand it's been dealt. Some countries have resources but lack defenses, while others may live in tough neighborhoods with hostile neighbors, or you actually may live in a peaceful neighborhood but lack access to trade routes. Does your country have fertile land? Does it have access to rivers, access to seas, oceans? What about the climate? Is it too hot? Is it too cold? Does the prevailing ideology fit your nation's character? These are all factors that create a nation's geopolitical reality, and as you'll see, understanding this is key to decoding why Russia is making the moves it's making today. In the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia found itself at rock bottom. Once the epicenter of a superpower, it was now economically shattered, politically unstable, and militarily weakened. Most importantly, Russia's carefully built geographical buffers were mostly gone, meaning Russia was once again exposed. But here's the twist. Instead of falling into panic mode, a surprising sense of optimism swept through Moscow. For the first time, Russian leaders believed there was a real shot at building a fresh, unified European security framework. This meant Russia's vulnerable western borders could finally be secure. The vast, flat terrain of the northern European plain, Russia's eternal Achilles heel, will no longer be an open invitation for invasion. Essentially, Russia would be overcoming all their security risks associated with their stubborn geography. As we know, this did not happen. NATO expanded eastward, and in the first wave of expansion, former Soviet allies like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined the alliance in 1999, moving NATO's infrastructure eastward along the European plain, closer to Russia's borders. For Russia, this was a stunning betrayal. The Soviet Union was gone, communism was over, and the Warsaw Pact dissolved. So why was NATO, a Cold War relic, still marching eastward? However, many would argue that the US didn't aggressively absorb these former Warsaw Pact nations. Instead, these nations wanted to join NATO. They wanted to join NATO and they did so willingly, seeking security and all the economic benefits that came with aligning with the West. The thing is though, NATO and EU membership at the time were dangled in front of Eastern Europe's nose, where membership would have been irresistible. Given Eastern Europe's vulnerabilities and lack of experience in self-determination, since Eastern Europe were part of one empire or another for centuries, the lure of joining was just simply too strong, and NATO's open door policy definitely made it more enticing. In effect, Eastern Europe traded one sphere of influence, the Soviet, for another, the US, because there was a perceived lack of alternatives. However, there was one country in Eastern Europe who stood out as an exception, and this was Serbia. Belgrade rejected these wider geoeconomic and political trends that sprung up along with the unipolar world order. Serbians felt they could carve out their own path forward. You see, Serbia has a fine history of statecraft and they wanted to choose their own independent path. Unfortunately, this was one of the many reasons which led to the dissolution of Yugoslavia and ultimately the subsequent bombing of Serbia by NATO in 1999. In the cruel, harsh world of geopolitics, this was a message to other Eastern European nations, including Russia, about the consequences of resisting US influence. So, as many Eastern European countries were jumping into US-led institutions as well as the bombing of Serbia, Russia got the message, and the message was clear. NATO isn't a defensive alliance. This was a force that could act on its own terms with or without global consensus. Now, imagine you're Russia and you're seeing this unfold before your very eyes. The Russians would be thinking, man, my western borders are vulnerable. Majority of my geographical barriers are no longer under my control. The northern European plain is being absorbed by NATO. And what's stopping this military alliance from moving into the heartland? All I have is their word, but where are my guarantees? You have to understand this, guys, from the security or realist point of view. NATO may call themselves a defensive alliance, but what guarantees are there for Russia? And that's what it all boils down to. Security must be concrete and it must be tangible. But anyway, it was at this point in history where the Russian leadership lost its optimism and suddenly made drastic changes. Yeltsin stepped down and Vladimir Putin came to power. It was essentially Ivan the Terrible all over again. Russia was being hemmed in on all sides, and Putin had to address this. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does surely rhyme. Fast forward to 2013, and 2 more NATO expansions later, another spark set things ablaze. The Euromaidan protests erupted in Ukraine, leading to the ousting of President Viktor Yanukovych. From Moscow's point of view, this was far more than a popular uprising. To Russia, it looked like a Western-backed coup designed to pull Ukraine, who sits in the heartland, firmly into the ever-expanding arms of NATO. And the potentiality of Ukraine joining NATO was a threat Russia wasn't willing to ignore. Then came Crimea, a red line like no other. Crimea, though a part of Ukraine, was one geographical barrier still held onto by Russia after losing the majority of the other barriers. By leasing the port of Sevastopol from Kiev, Russia's Black Sea Fleet is based in Sevastopol. And losing Crimea wouldn't just mean losing a warm water port or a naval base, it would mean losing the strategic shield that is the Crimean Peninsula, which protected Russia's entire southern flank. Crimea has been Russia's defensive barrier for centuries, a natural fortress protecting the heartland. Losing it would mean Russia was dangerously exposed. If you want more details about this, please watch part 1 to this episode. So, in the following year, in 2014, Russia made its move. It annexed Crimea swiftly and decisively. There was no waiting or no negotiating with the West or Kiev over this. Russia saw its vital interests under threat, and as any great power would, it acted without hesitation. By the way, the annexation wasn't some grand surprise. It was actually a very predictable response. A predictable response from a nation who felt cornered and was determined to secure its defenses. While it grabbed Crimea, Russia was still willing to find some kind of compromising solution to the rest of Ukraine. And how do we know this? Well, besides all the diplomatic maneuvering that went on, like the Minsk Accords, to find a settlement to this crisis, the fact that Russia didn't invade Ukraine until 8 years later in 2022 is a revelation in itself. Because contrary to popular belief, this is most unusual behavior from great powers. Guys, ordinarily, great powers react quickly, dramatically, and intensively when their core security interest is under threat. We've seen this happen so many times in history. nations who are able to defend their core security interests will react immediately to any perceived threats. Perhaps the most famous example of this is the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the Cubans were seeking to join the Soviet military alliance and have Soviet missiles placed on their island, Washington freaked out. They freaked out so much so that they were prepared to take the whole world down in a nuclear war because they perceived their core security was under threat. In other words, in international relations, if you threaten a nation's core security, you better be prepared to fight. This goes beyond ideological reasoning or economic reasoning. As I said in part 1, security is primary. So when the Russians didn't react or move into the entirety of Ukraine and focused only on Crimea, this was actually rather unusual behavior, especially from a great power who is super fearful of invasions and who's super exposed. So why didn't Russia immediately react in regards to the rest of Ukraine? Well, it's because they prefer Ukraine to be neutral. It's what they've been ultimately negotiating for. This obviously goes against the narrative, as the narrative claims this was an unprovoked attack. Not only was it an unprovoked attack, Russia aims to conquer all of Ukraine, and then after Ukraine, they won't just stop there, they will continue on to the Baltics and Poland and onwards to God knows where. Look, it's time to expand on these particular misconceptions. As I just stated, many think Russia's endgame is to conquer Ukraine. But here's the truth, that doesn't line up with Russia's geopolitical realities. Russia hasn't got the resources nor the manpower it once had as the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. To control all of Ukraine would be a massive drain. In a similar way, it was a massive drain for the Soviets to control all of Eastern Europe. Hence, Russia's ideal scenario is Ukraine to be neutral. A neutral Ukraine would mean that the southern flanks are still protected. Since no foreign power will be present there, Ukraine will be in charge of its own security and Russia won't have to allocate its own resources to the security of Ukraine. Essentially, it's a win-win for all. Also, back in 2014, the landscape in terms of balance of power in Eastern Europe was as follows. Belarus was firmly within Moscow's security framework, while Ukraine and Finland were neutral, and NATO forces were stationed in the heartland but contained within the Baltics only. But hang on a second, the Baltics joined NATO. The Baltics are in the heartland, so doesn't that mean the northern flanks are compromised? Isn't this a major threat to Russian security? Yes, that is correct, but the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad makes the difference. Thanks to Kaliningrad, which used to be called Königsberg, which was a part of Germany back in the day, Russia holds the strategic advantage if NATO were ever to attack through the Baltic states. In other words, Russia has defensive dominance. Actually, if you guys want me to do a deep dive into the current strategic balance within the Baltics, feel free to drop a comment below. It's super interesting. But on the flip side, if Russia were to attack, NATO would then have the advantage in a defensive fight. This mutual defensive dominance essentially kept both sides in check. Neither is willing to attack knowing the other held the edge defensively. In other words, strategic balance. Very important, strategic balance. So in a localized conventional war, both sides had defensive dominance that discourages any type of aggression. Because of this, all Russia had to focus on is the 400-kilometer border between Poland and Belarus. Okay, now, here is where the media narrative truly crumbles. Imagine if Russia actually took control of Ukraine. Suddenly the front line Russia would need to defend wouldn't be just the manageable 400 kilometers between Poland and Belarus. It would actually become a massive 1,400-kilometer border spanning all the way from Romania to Hungary, Slovakia, and Poland. That's an additional 1,000 kilometers of vulnerable borders to protect. A colossal strain on modern-day Russian resources and manpower, especially when you take the Bessarabian Gap into account, another weak point in Russian defenses. Russia would have to beef up Moldova and it would have to beef up its border with Romania to secure the Bessarabian Gap. It's just too big of a headache for Moscow to deal with. Yet, of course, if push came to shove, Russia would still prefer this scenario over having NATO parked directly in Ukraine. Why? Because if NATO was successful in fully integrating Ukraine, coupled with the existing NATO presence in the Baltics, then the entire balance shifts. The United States would suddenly have a massive foothold within the heartland from both the southern flank and northern flank, and could easily push through the northern European plain. In this scenario, the border would be suddenly thousands of kilometers long on a flat, open terrain with no natural barriers. With modern weaponry, Moscow would be an absolute sitting duck. In other words, the United States would gain what's known as escalation dominance. If you recall in my previous video, this is essentially what Peter the Great faced when he tried to secure Russia's northern flanks against Sweden, or what Russia once faced with its southern flanks against the Ottoman Empire. Escalation dominance, essentially a strategic upper hand that would leave Russia with almost no room to maneuver defensively. In other words, Russia's war in Ukraine is once again simply preventing strategic imbalance from occurring. By being positioned in Ukraine, as well as the Baltics and Poland too, the US would have a figurative gun aimed straight at Russia's heartland. This is a nightmare scenario for Moscow because it strips away Russia's defensive advantage, leaving it exposed. Diplomatically, this is also known as leverage, the power to dictate terms. I also mentioned this in part 1 of the first episode. Again, please check it out if you haven't already. If the West can push Russia into a corner, Russia loses its sovereignty, which means Russia is forced to comply with Western demands, or it would have to face the constant threat of immediate escalation. And now the big picture. Why is the US doing this? For the United States, removing Russia as a strategic rival solidifies its global dominance, creating a world where the US can operate with unchallenged influence, especially as China will be left standing alone without Russia's backing. I've heard ideological arguments where people have said if only Russia was a liberal democracy, then there wouldn't be any dramas. But again, ideology is used only as a tool to achieve geopolitical goals. Imagine if Russia actually was a liberal democracy and it shared all the values as the West does. What would happen is that the United States would simply find another reason to demonize the Russians and move its military structure eastward. Because unlike Germany or Japan, Russia is a geopolitical rival and rivals cannot be tolerated. It's important to note that the US isn't an evil empire, just like how Russia isn't an evil empire. Geopolitics is never this simple. The United States is a hegemon, and for the past 25 years we have been living in a unipolar world order. And so the US is simply conducting in classic hegemonic behavior. Hegemons seek to maintain their hegemony. Some benefit from this hegemony while others don't. It's just the nature of these things. Therefore, the United States will continue supporting this war. It doesn't matter now that Donald Trump is in power. Even if Trump suddenly were to end this war, it will be done so because the US picked a fight that it lost. So, how might this war end? The answer seems pretty clear. Russia will push for a resolution where Ukraine remains neutral. In addition, Russia will seek formal recognition of the 5 regions, Crimea, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Lugansk, as Russian territory. If Ukraine refuses to agree to neutrality, Russia will continue the conflict by intensifying its military pressure and potentially seizing even more land until it reaches a strong geographical barrier. If the Russians cannot receive security guarantees, then ultimately they will create their own. The first significant natural barrier is the Dnieper River, a substantial and difficult to cross obstacle, especially if it's fortified. Russia's initial goal will be to reach the river's right bank, establish defensive lines along it, and at this stage, Russia will once again demand Ukraine's neutrality. Well, actually, Russia will continuously be demanding Ukraine's neutrality. But anyway, if Ukraine continues to refuse, then Russia may consider moving beyond the Dnieper and then advancing towards the next formidable barrier, which in this case is the Carpathian Mountains. And this will ultimately mean that Russia would be absorbing the entirety of Ukraine. As you can imagine, this would be so very sad and unfortunate, not just for the Ukrainians, but for the Russians themselves, essentially for all sides who were involved. This dark situation is being sadly pushed by the stark disconnection between the popular media narrative of Russia being an empire-hungry aggressor and the underlying geopolitical reality. Russia's main goal isn't to conquer Ukraine or to expand its territory or to attack NATO countries. It is simply to secure its borders and maintain strategic balance in Eastern Europe. With NATO's expansion pressing against its western frontier and the potential of Ukraine becoming a NATO stronghold, Russia faces what it views as an existential security threat. The ideal resolution for Moscow, as well as Ukraine, would be for Ukraine to be neutral, which serves as a buffer without foreign military presence. Foreign military presence from Russian side or foreign military presence from NATO's side. The outcome of this war will hinge on Ukraine's willingness to embrace neutrality and balancing the demands of both East and West in a region long trapped between global powers. And that's the harsh reality of geopolitics. Thank you guys for sticking till the very end. Like and subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the comment section below. Have a good one.